morning, or depending when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and as always told, out of Voice of Radio. So today, we are continuing our look at the complete history of the Pokemon trading card game, and we are going to be taking a look at a frankly redonkulously exciting set. It's Noble Victories, and I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I'm going to spoil the surprise a little bit. Noble Victories was, as I like to phrase it, a nuts good set. Now, of course, last week we had a chat about Emerging Powers, and to be blunt, Emerging Powers was not a powerhouse set. It gave us Pokemon Catcher, which is a card that would transform the game for, well, the entire time before they errated and broke it. But there wasn't a huge amount other than that. Believe me when I say Noble Victories, this was a phenomenal set. Although, of course, the next set, which we should be looking at next week, barring any big news, was Next Destinies. And let's say Next Destinies might have raised the game a little bit more. Now, Noble Victories was released in Japan on July the 15th, 2011, and it did make its way out in English on November the 16th. 2011, just a few months later. And it was weird because this was really Japan's second black and white set. We kind of invented Emerging Powers from some leftover cards from their first sets and promos, etc., which incidentally does go quite a long way to explaining why Emerging Powers was, as a whole, a fairly underwhelming set. But it was a little bit weird because I always see this as a bit of a weird in-between time for the Pokemon TCG. Because back when we were in the Heart Gold Soul Silver eras, we had all of those primes and they were cool. And then we ended up, in the very next set with all of the EXs. And we didn't really have these interesting chase cards with new mechanics. At this stage, all we actually had was the full art versions of existing cards. Now, incidentally, we did have a couple in here, because this was a set that brought in a bunch of legendary Pokemon. So we had the debuts of Virizion, Terrakion, and Cobalion. And to go along with that, we had full art versions of Virizion, Terrakion, and Cobalion. Interesting to note that they were, in fact, the exact same cards, just with different full art, but the Terrakion is one of my it might be my second favourite card ever released. I would put it comfortably in the top 3, so I bought a bunch of these full arts when I had the chance at the time. But the Pokemon that really made its debut here and really came around in the set was Victini. This was the Victini set. Now, the other full art Pokemon we had was in fact full art Victini, but even more than that, look at the set symbol. This is something that happens very, very rarely in the Pokemon trading card game, but the set symbol is actually like part of Victini's head. We don't usually get that. This was the full-on Victini set. And what was really cool here was that we actually had 3 Victinis in the set. Now, the best one of them was the one that was printed as a full art. We're going to get more into it later, but it basically meant you could just reflip coins. So when you flipped coins for an attack, you could reflip them only once, and you would reflip all or nothing, but it was a ridiculous ability that saw a huge amount of play. We also had the V-Create Victini, that if you had at least 5 bench Pokemon, which without anything else meant a full bench, you did 100 for 2 energy, which was pretty good. And then we had one Psychic Victini, that for 1 Psychic energy did 120 damage, if you flipped double heads. I played so many decks featuring this. Obviously, the chance of getting double heads isn't high, but obviously it's also made a lot higher by the other, the Victory Star as we called it, Victini. Never really worked, but man, I tried that so much. It was also, incidentally, the pre-release promo, the Psychic one as it happens, which it kind of had to be. This was the Victini set after all, and once again we had one of those pre-release deck boxes, which you also got for rocking up to the pre-release. Now, there were a couple of other legendary Pokemon that made their debut in the set, albeit a little bit muted. We got ourselves a Kyurem, And if we look at the card, it is clearly the third version, so to speak, of Reshiram and Zekrom. They've all got 130 HP, retreat cost of 2, etc. They've all got the Outrage attack. The difference with Kyurem, of course, was the Glaciate attack that for free energy does 30 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon. I did play a deck that was largely just quad Kyurem. It did need the EX, which we wouldn't get for a little while. But man, that deck was fun. I actually topped a tournament with it, although it was the luckiest I've ever gotten in any tournament ever in terms of matchups. It was basically auto-win after auto-win. It was kind of a little bit silly. We also saw the debut of Landorus here. Now, this was a card I was pretty excited about. It did not fit with the others. Having said that, it was the third version of Thundurus and Tornadus that, of course, we did have a look at last week. And it's a similar kind of thing. One attack to accelerate or move energy, and one attack to do a decent amount of damage. Again, I played way too much of this card. Interestingly, it didn't get a full art in the set, but quite a while later, we would actually see it getting a promo full art in a little set. These promo full arts for a while were super cheap. And even now you can pick them up for well under $10. So I would kind of recommend doing so because honestly, this Landorus is kind of awesome. And I don't know how much it counts, but we might as well shout out that Volcarona also made its debut here. But let's just say Volcarona isn't quite on the level of Landorus or Kyurem. Now, one of the things that was super weird here is that we actually got a brand new fossil mechanic. So we did have the new fossil Pokemon making their debut in this particular set. We got Archeops and we got Caracosta. And along with the new fossil Pokemon, we got a new fossil mechanic. But it was a super weird fossil mechanic. Essentially, what you would have to do, and let's look at Cover Fossil as an example here, was you would look at the bottom 7 cards of your deck, and it allowed you to reveal a Tirtouga you find there, and put it onto your bench. It was an extremely strange mechanic that, to be blunt, didn't really work and kind of broke fossil Pokemon, which was a little bit sad. But it was a new mechanic, and it's something that does need to be mentioned. Speaking of which, I should also mention that when we got to Plasma Blast, Pokemon basically decided that this new fossil mechanic was in fact not working, and they printed Tirtouga and Archon with Prehistoric Cool, which allowed you, if the Pokemon was in your discard pile, to put it on the bottom of your deck, which then meant you could play Cover Fossil, and it would guarantee to get Tirtouga. It did help, incidentally, but these cards were never great for the fossil mechanic. Archeops was, but we'll get there in a moment. Now, in terms of the full art, I've already mentioned that we saw Virizion, Terrakion, and Cobalion, and I've already mentioned Victini, but we did actually see a full art N here as well. We saw an actual full art supporter, which is not something Pokemon really did very much at the time at all. This was not Pokemon's MO. Nowadays, you buy a set, well, assuming you're watching this in 2021, I'm hoping this video lasts for decades, because they take so long to make. But as we're recording at the moment, every set has a few full art supporters. This was a big deal at the time, because this was not the kind of thing that Pokemon tend to do. And there was a secret rare Meowth. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, hang on a second. How come there was a secret rare Pikachu in the black and white base set, and then there was nothing in Emerging Powers, and then they brought in a secret rare Meowth in this set? The reason is, remember, up to this stage, we were actually on the second Japanese set, and Japan had one of these secret rares in each set, so there wasn't 3 secret rares to share over the first 3 sets. Black and White in Japan had 1 secret rare. Our first 2 sets were basically Japan's first set with some promos, so we only had 1 secret rare to go between the first 2 sets. But we have Meowth here, and that's nice. In terms of the most expensive card, it really was Full Art N, and this is still going for about $80, and the reason is really simple. We're at the stage now, remember, Expanded is black and white on. So every card well, again, assuming you're listening as I record this, or shortly thereafter, black and white on is what we're playing in Expanded. So every card I'm looking at in these videos at the moment is legal in the Expanded format. N is super good still in Expanded, and this is the coolest version of N, so yeah. Expect this one, even though supporters are generally not as valuable as Pokemon cards, expect this one to not be going anywhere anytime soon. Looking at theme decks, we are talking about Excelgor and Escavalier, which I very much appreciate because, well, they were kind of a pair of Pokemon in Gen 5, and they end up with a theme deck. I think that's really cool. Fast Days was the Excelgor theme deck. You got yourself both a holo and a non-holo Excelgor. Holo Excelgor being exclusive to the deck. It was a non-holo in the set. And then you got yourself non-holos of Lilligant, Volcarona, and Livani. And Livani was an interesting one because, again, that was a holo in the set, so the non-holo was exclusive. Kind of cool that you also got a coin featuring Excelgor and Escavalier, which incidentally would also be in Furious Knights, although a slightly different colour. Furious Knights, you got your Escavalier in both holo and non-holo, with the holo version being exclusive to the deck. And then you got yourself non-holo versions of Zeb Striker, Druddigon, and Electros, the Pokemon I like because it's literally got my name in it. And again, the non-holo version of Electros was exclusive to the deck. It was a holo in the set normally. Now, I've told you that this was a good set, and as we look at the good cards, there were a lot of good cards, but none were better than N. And N was a weird one because it was actually a reprint of Rocket's Admin, which obviously we looked at in a previous history video. And the thing is that a lot of players at the time weren't obviously playing back when Rocket's Admin initially came out. So they'd kind of missed it. Believe me, ladies and gentlemen, we all got it in the end. You see, Rocket's Admin and N, they both make you shuffle, both players, shuffle a hand into their deck, and then draw a number of cards equal to their remaining prize card. It is the best comeback card we've actually got, because if your opponent takes a big lead, this will just bring them right back down. And it was a weird thing, right? That essentially everybody at the time would complain that the good players always had an N when they went down to one prize remaining. Well, yeah. In round 3 of the last chance qualifier at Worlds 2012, I played against Faris Sakum, a wonderful player, and 3 games in a row I got ends to 1. That was not a coincidence. Good players would play out their games to make it happen. But as well as a comeback card, it was also a draw card. It was basically a 4 of in like every deck for the whole time it was legal. Now, Terrakion was like I said, one of my very favourite cards ever, and it's all because of the Retaliate attack. It did have a second attack, but nobody used it. 2 energy, 30 damage. If any of your Pokemon were knocked out by damage from your opponent's attack during his or her last turn, you did 60 more damage. And to be blunt, this was a Darkrai counter. In a couple of weeks' time, we are going to get to Dark Explorers, and we're going to be talking about Darkrai properly, but Darkrai was just one of the very, very best cards we have ever seen in the history of the game. It was played a huge amount by a huge amount of players, and we're talking about basically the best counter to it. It was phenomenal. Also, electric decks. And hey, this is a good time to talk about electric decks. Electric decks were very, 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 very good because we had the ability Dynamotor. Once during your turn, you may attach a lightning energy from your discard pile to one of your benched Pokemon. To be perfectly blunt, this was phenomenal for years to come. It was partnered basically any Pokemon that used lightning or colourless energy, and we will see a bunch of these over the next few videos, would make decks with electric, which were just phenomenal decks. And we've seen this ability since on other Pokemon. It's always good, incidentally, but I don't think it was ever quite as good as it was on electric. One thing that was really cool, there was a Dynamo in this set that for a single energy did 10 damage plus paralysis on a coin flip, and after a little while everybody realised that they could combine that Dynamo with the Victini, the Victory Star Victini, to essentially give themselves a 75% chance of paralysis, and what they ended up doing was basically just setting up this awkward to set up deck, but doing it behind frankly, a wall of paralysis. And it worked really rather nicely. Now, we've already mentioned all three of the Victini. By far the best one was the Victory Star Victini. This saw a huge amount of play in a huge amount of decks. Now, the Fire Victini, the V-Create Victini, this got you 2 energy 100 damage, especially when Verizon decks started becoming really good. Now, this wasn't until Plasma Blast, it was a little way away here, but when those decks really started coming around, this was actually a really nice counter to them. Single prize Pokemon, if you could get an extra energy on there, which really wasn't that difficult. You know, if you're playing, say, an electric deck, it would go on there quite nicely. And then all of a sudden, you're getting a one-hit KO for 2 prizes and really hurting their setup. Let's just say it worked rather nicely indeed. And the Psychic one really was just a gimmick. It was fun, and I tried it in a bunch of decks, and I got a pre-release, because remember, it was the pre-release promo. At pre-releases, it was amazing. Outside of pre-releases, it didn't work as well as you might have hoped it would. But speaking of the Victory Star Victini, Vanillux. Vanillux was a ridiculous card. Double freeze for 2 energy, let you flip 2 coins. You did 40 damage for each heads, but if either of them were heads, the defending Pokemon was now paralyzed. Which means if you put Victini down, and if you didn't put Victini down, why are you not putting Victini down? The only way your opponent avoided paralysis was if you flipped 4 tails in a row. The chance of doing so, incidentally, is 1 in 16, which basically gave you a 94% chance of paralysis. Matthew Blower went and got a top 4 at the UK Nationals with Vanillux, purely because just kept paralysing. And people were mad about it at the time. How did Vanillux get top 4 at Nationals? Well, yes, basically paralysis every turn. Obviously, this would be combined with Vileplume, because Vileplume would turn off switching cards. So essentially, you were item locked and paralysed 15 out of every 16 turns. Yeah, this was an annoying one. And I'm a big fan of Gen 5, right? And one of my other favourite Pokemon from Gen 5 is Chandelure. I like Vanillux, I like Terrakion, I like Chandelure. And Chandelure is awesome. And this particular Chandelure was particularly awesome. Now, Chandelure was here for the ability Cursed Shadow. And Cursed Shadow basically let you, if it was active, place 3 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon in any way that you like. And this was a really cool card. Now, it wasn't quite good enough yet. We would need the Excelgor, which would come along in a couple of sets' time. But just to give you an example, right? This is the Excelgor that came around in Dark Explorers, so we're not too far away. For 2 energy, double colourless, you did 50 damage, plus paralysis, plus poison, and you shuffled Excelgor and all cards attached to it into your deck. And then you would put Chandelure active, and then the next turn you would retreat Chandelure and attack with Excelgor, and round we go. Obviously combining it with Vileplume for the ability lock. When I played at Worlds in 2012, the only year I ever was able to actually afford to make the trip, I played against Pablo Meza, and I had the donk, but he went first and boo hiss, etc. But it was one of my favourite losses ever, because somehow Pablo actually manipulated the game using these tricks and using Chandelure to take 6 prizes in a single turn. Obviously, N was always a worry at the time, so Chandelure could help you take many prizes in one turn, so you would set them up and finish off with Chandelure, not giving your opponent a few turns to burn you with N. Now, Archeops was such a good card, it actually ended up getting banned, but it would be a while before this happened. Now, the ability on Archeops is frankly over the top, dumb nuts phenomenal. It basically just stops your opponent playing evolution Pokemon. It's clearly a ridiculous, broken, over-the-top card. The thing is, it was super awkward to actually get into play. I told you the fossil mechanic didn't really work. So if you were playing a basics deck, remember this turned off both players from evolving their Pokemon. If you could pull this off, it was amazing. But it was so difficult to actually get into play. And now several years down the line, we would end up in Primal Clash and we'd get Maxie's Hidden Ball Trick, which would allow you to put a fighting Pokemon from your discard pile onto your bench and draw 5 cards. So you wouldn't have to evolve up Archeops. You could literally get a turn 1 Archeops because you would get it in the discard and then play it with Maxie's Hidden Ball Trick. Archeops actually got unbanned and expanded, but only because Maxie's Hidden Ball Trick got banned. It broke the game, but it wouldn't for a while. But as well as giving me one of my very favourite cards ever, this set also gave me one of my least favourite cards ever, in the form of Durant. Now, I've literally made videos on this channel about how much I hate Durant, but 1 Metal Energy. For each of your Durant in play, discard the top card of your opponent's deck. So you would get 4 Durant out, and then you would just aim to mill your opponent out. Bearing in mind, it's not just the fact that you're milling 4 cards. Every time you mill, you're taking options out of their deck that they can't use. This became a top tier deck, and I absolutely hated it. Cobalion was another very good card that came around in this set. It had Energy Press, 20 damage, plus 20 more for each energy attached to the defending Pokemon. Could punish them for putting too much energy on, but mostly it was here for Iron Breaker. Free energy, 80 damage, the defending Pokemon can't attack during your opponent's next turn. Obviously, again, Vileplume decks loved this, but this was a really nice tech that made its way into a whole bunch of decks. Kyurem, I mentioned earlier, this was a really cool card. Outrage was fun, but this was one of those ones, if you could get free energy on there and just glaciate over and over again, you could just wipe your opponent's board, bearing in mind it was another one of these cards that really got around N because your opponent couldn't end you to a low hand because you wouldn't be taking prizes until you took loads at once. Combining Kyurem and EXP Share did give me one of my favourite decks ever and did help you to make Glaciate a bit easier. It was never a real powerhouse card, but I did love it. Similarly, Landorus was another one of these with a lot of potential that didn't quite work as well as we liked. Now, Landorus looked amazing. It had an attack that accelerated energy to itself, and it hit weakness against Darkrai, Electric, things of that nature that were among the very, very best decks in the entire game. Also did 10 damage to each bench Pokemon, yours and your opponent's, but it just always ended up being a little bit slow and not quite good enough. Now, Virizion was another kind of cool card that did pop up here and there. For 1 energy, you drew 2 cards, and Leaf Wallop did a decent amount of damage, but it was a nice early game Pokemon in some grass decks, or even just to draw cards and get you rolling. Seismitoad made a nice little fun rogue deck with Round, did 30 damage for each of your Pokemon in play that have the Round attack. It wasn't quite good enough yet. It really would need Meloetta, which again was a few years away at this stage, but Meloetta was a basic Pokemon that had Round. Now, it was also an EX Pokemon, gave up 2 prizes, etc. It wouldn't actually come around until Legendary Treasures. But Meloetta basically allowed you to have basic Pokemon, so you could, in the best case scenario, get 6 Pokemon in play, all with Round, and do 180 damage for a double colourless energy. It was more of a fun rogue deck than a real powerhouse, but it was fun. Druddigon was a nice little card. It had an ability whereby if you attacked it and were mean enough to do any damage, you would then have to take 2 damage counters back. And then for free energy, it did 60 damage and stopped retreating. Not a powerhouse, but a fun little card that saw a bit of play here and there. Stunfisk was kind of a fun one. It was the rare example of a Pokemon whose energy requirements don't match its type. So it was a fighting Pokemon that attacked for lightning and colourless energy. So in these electric decks, for instance, you could put this in, and you wouldn't have to play any other kind of energy, just the lightning you were already playing, but you would be able to hit that fighting weakness, which I'm hoping by now you've realised was quite a big deal at the time. And I have to shout out Conkeldurr here. Now, Conkeldurr was never good, but it had the amazing ability that gave it an extra 20 HP for each fighting energy attached to it. We all tried it, ladies and gentlemen. Incidentally, if you're ever looking to try and do the most damage in the history of the Pokemon trading card game, I'm not going to tell you everything. It's a video I've been working on for far too long. But if you're ever looking for the most damage ever in the history of the Pokemon trading card game, you want to use this Conqueror. There's a little bit of a hint for you. Of course, the problem was that in the next set we would get Mewtwo that not only was the best card in the game, not only hit it for weakness, but actually did more damage for each energy you had on you. So, yeah. Shall we say Conqueror was never going to survive in a Mewtwo world. But that ability alone makes me just want to give it a little bit of a shout out. Now, we did have some nice trainers here. Eviolite was an absolute powerhouse. Eviolite went on a basic Pokemon and reduced damage done by 20. You're going to see over the next few sets that basic Pokemon got, to put it bluntly, too much help over the course of these sets. And this really was just the beginning of it. I should mention, if I haven't made it clear already, all Pokemon EX were basics, so Eviolite could reduce damage done to any of them. You know it saw a huge amount of play. Rocky Helmet didn't see as much play here, but it was a very, very cool card. It had Druddigon's ability, but as a tool card. You attached it to one of your Pokemon, and if they got damaged, you put 2 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. It was cool. It was a fun card. And of course, if you put it on a Druddigon, your opponent would take 4 damage counters when they attacked you, which was kind of hilarious. Oh yeah, and Super Rod. And this was weird, right? Because this wasn't the first Super Rod we'd ever seen. Super Rod actually came out many years before, right back in the Gen 2 era, in Neo Genesis. But in Neo Genesis, it let you flip a coin. If heads, you put an evolution card from your discard pile into your hand. If tails, it put a basic Pokemon from your discard pile into your hand. This was nothing like that. This let you shuffle free in any combination of Pokemon and basic energy from your discard pile into your deck. It was actually a reprint of Night Maintenance with a different name. Whatever it was the best recovery we had, and it saw a gigantic amount of play. Now, moving over into the best decks, we did actually see a bunch of decks that did come around in this set. I could tell you about Quad Kyurem, but we really needed Kyurem EX here. I could tell you about Chandelure, but we really did need Excelgor. I could tell you about Seismitoad, but we really did need Meloetta. But there were some decks that really did come around as a result of this set. And I've already told you about my least favourite deck ever. It's Durant. And Durant really was a deck that was all built around getting 4 Durant in play and just milling 4 cards from your opponent turn after turn after turn, and it just kept going. Now, there were some other cards that were really useful here. Crushing Hammer that we mentioned before, clearly a very good card. Get rid of your opponent's energy, slow them down, that was pretty good. You never took prizes. You only were milling your opponent. I did once see somebody win a sudden death game with Durant by milling. It took like 25 minutes and ruined all of our evenings. But man, it was funny to see. But because you're always behind on prizes, Twins became an amazing card. Because it just turned into a search your deck for any 2 cards, which is a little bit ridiculous. And then we did mention previously that combination of Rotom and Alphalithograph, whereby Alphalithograph would tell you, or show you, which prizes were where, and Rotom would let you swap the top card of your deck for one of your prizes. So this was essentially your way of making sure that your Durant never ended up prized, and if they did end up prized, because obviously they would sometimes, you would be able to essentially get them back again. This was a legit deck that won a whole bunch of tournaments, and, well, let's just say I've made videos about how much I hate it. Now, Electric wasn't really ready yet. In this set, it wasn't really Electric's time. There were some really good Electric decks, they weren't here yet. However, Zekrom Eels did see a bunch of play. Wasn't really the best build of it, but obviously here, you could just constantly have a Zekrom going, and you would just be hitting 120 turn after turn after turn after turn, and that worked. That was kind of cool. It's also really worth noting that Eviolite reduced damage done by attacks, not by your opponent's attacks. So this would actually mean that you took less damage from your own attack, which was pretty gosh darned important. Now, Vanillux was a really fun one, and honestly, there were really 3 cards that turned Vanillux into a pretty powerhouse deck. You had, obviously, Vanillux itself, with the double freeze, which was pretty important. You had Victini to allow you to reflip to give you that 15 in 16 chance, which was pretty gosh darned important. And then, of course, you would need Vileplume. Vileplume turned off item cards, and there are a bunch of item cards always that can switch your active with one of your bench. You don't want that, ladies and gentlemen, or you don't want your opponent to have that. So being able to stop that was honestly pretty gosh darned vital. I mean, it was another one where twins became really, really important because you'd go behind on prize. You know, you're a double stage 2 deck and neither of your stage 2s has a draw engine. You would usually give up a few prizes in the meantime, but that didn't really matter because by the time you were rolling, your opponent just couldn't get going. And if they didn't one-hit KO Vanillux, Vanillux was quite beefy, they just would never KO it because they'd maybe get a hit after you got a KO, and then you'd paralyze until you KO'd, etc. There were entire games against Vanillux where you were just paralyzed every single turn. And the last new deck that came around was actually Quad Terrakion. And Quad Terrakion might not be the best deck ever, but over on PTCGRadio.com, really good website for old deck lists, they reminded me that Roland Allen actually won Australian Nationals with this deck. And this was a full quad deck, by which I mean you literally played 4 Terrakion, and they were your only Pokemon. But this meant that you would be able to fit in a lot more cards. So you would be able to play things like 4+ power, so that you were doing as much damage as possible. Obviously, remember at the time we had Junk Arm, so it was one of those decks where even though you might not always be doing as much damage as you could, you'd generally be doing like 90 damage. Either with Retaliate or with Land Crush, you'd be doing 90 damage. But Plus Power and Junk Arm would let you do extra damage. And then, of course, we had Pokemon Catcher and Junk Arm, which would give you Gusting like every single turn. And actually, this built up pretty quickly. Now, Revive was very important because you were only playing 4 Pokemon and you would need 6 because of the whole 6 prizes thing. So certainly having Revive was pretty gosh darned important, if I'm honest with you. And like we mentioned with Quad Kyurem, EXP share was amazing. You couldn't rely on Retaliate when this was your only Pokemon. You'd be needing to Land Crush quite a bit. So this was pretty gosh darn good, because every time a Terrakion got KO'd, an energy would go onto a bench Terrakion with EXP share. Obviously, the goal here is to have like 3 Terrakion with EXP share, and they each get 1 energy when you get KO'd. And of course, remember, after a Terrakion gets KO'd, you only need 2 energy for Retaliate. So if you've got 1 energy on Terrakion from EXP share, your active gets KO'd, energy goes onto your Terrakion on the bench, you Retaliate, next turn you attack for turn, and then you can Land Crush, and you're good to go. It was another one of these decks that had really good and really bad matchups. You couldn't rely on really winning tournament after tournament with this because it was so reliant on some good and bad matchups, but my word, was it a fun deck. And there we go, ladies and gentlemen. Noble Victories was a redonkulous set, and I tell you what, as great as the set was, and make no mistake about it, this was a great set. Next week, we're going to talk about Next Destinies, and somehow, Next Destinies is actually going to come out looking even better. I know, right? For now, I want you to tell me what you think about this set. Either your memories if you were playing at the time, or your thoughts having seen them for the first time if you weren't. Go nuts in the comment section, but be nice! And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at TheWasi, and Twitch for some live action at twitch.tv/PTCGRadio. If you want to support the channel, get some bonus podcasts and all that good stuff, head on over to patreon.com/PTCGRadio, where you can do exactly that. But by far the most important thing as always, look after yourselves till next time, would ya? Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.